feature presentation.
Welcome back to another Untitled movie review. I am one of your hosts, Matt Rohrbeck, alongside he's allergic to tomatoes, but he is tomato meter approved, Eric Marchin.
Matt, we're talking about a big one today. One of the last big movies of the year, one of the most anticipated movies in recent memory, and one that has had a very tricky trajectory given the loss, the untimely loss of Chadwick Boseman with Black Panther: Wakanda Forever.
Yes, today we are reviewing the end of Phase 4, technically, but we have the Guardians of the Galaxy Holiday special presentation, which is coming in a couple weeks, actually. I can't believe that. But we are at the end of Phase 4. Yes, we are reviewing spoiler-free, completely spoiler-free. We won't touch anything that was not in the trailers. So if you've even been avoiding the trailers, you might want to bounce out. But we will touch on some things in the trailers, but we won't be giving major plot beats or any spoilers, obviously. But then we will have a spoiler cast, which will go up on the day of release that you guys can listen to, which will go into every little nook and cranny of the movie. But yes, today we are reviewing Ryan Coogler's Black Panther: Wakanda Forever, starring Letitia Wright, Lupita Nyong'o, Danai, Gurira, Winston Duke, Dominique, Thorne, Florence, Kasumba, Michaela, Coel, Tenoch, Huerta, or Tenoch, Huerta.
No, you had it right the first time.
I did it? Okay. Martin Freeman, Angela Bassett, and many more. Eric, how are you this Sunday afternoon?
Well, Matt, it's interesting because, like, you know, you're coming in to talk about a movie that, you know, is a part of this larger franchise overall, and is also supposed to be entertainment first and foremost. And we have seen a lot of sort of the mortality of characters within the MCU in the last little bit, and I think that kind of began really with Endgame. Spoiler alert, Iron Man dies, but the difference there is that Robert Downey Jr. is fine and is, you know, going on with his life and things like that, where when somebody passes away well before their time and they're a part of something this big, what do you do? And I can't imagine what Ryan Coogler and Joe Robert Cole, the co-writer on this, were even thinking, because, you know, they've been doing press recently about, like, having an original script that had T'Challa in it, and that was, you know, like 2 weeks around the time that Chadwick Boseman passed away, so they had to, you know, start from scratch and rewrite the whole thing. So what do? Do you recast? Do you try to, you know, take that mantle and give it to the next generation? Do you, you know, subsequently, you know, focus on the women of Wakanda, or what, you know, and not just looking at it from, you know, a narrative standpoint, but from a compassionate standpoint. You know, these are people that worked with Chadwick Boseman. You know, this cast and crew had a relationship with this man, and it's like, you know, how do you move on with respecting that memory, and then also, you know, continue the legacy of the character and the world and everything that you built in that 2018 movie that was nominated for Best Picture at the Academy Awards and kind of was this huge breakthrough in the MCU, and got a lot of people that maybe didn't like Marvel movies to really kind of reconsider,
pay attention,
and recontextualize what a Marvel movie can be. So all of that is weighing on you as a moviegoer when you're sitting down to watch this thing, and at nearly 3 hours long, you're wondering to yourself, okay, are they going to stick the landing, and how are they going to navigate such an emotionally raw
it's a tricky situation,
story?
really.
And I think Coogler, you know, we'll talk more about the press conference in our regular show, but I think Coogler, you know, even stated there that it's better to just embrace it and embrace those feelings and put them into the script
to the movie,
than not even acknowledge them. So with that in mind, the opening sequence of this film might be the most somber within the MCU, where you're actually mourning the loss not only of a character but of the actor who played him one final time. And that really sets a different tone going into this movie than other Marvel films.
Yeah.
Even more so than Endgame, where, you know, like at the beginning of Endgame, you get a moment where it's the leftovers, where people, the heroes lost and they're stewing in, you know, their grief. But this is different because
Real. It has that
it's
meta
real.
layer on it, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
it has. It's tricky, man, and we'll get into our thoughts on the movie, but that's a great starting point because I don't know what you do, because obviously T'Challa and Chadwick Boseman was being poised as kind of what it felt like. That first Black Panther movie came right before Infinity War. He was introduced in Civil War. He was a big part of both Infinity War and the end of Endgame, and it seemed like he was going to be catapulted into that kind of, like, being as successful as that first movie was, like a big, huge part of this universe moving forward, right? A great actor, a great character that is unfortunately taken from us way too early. And what do you do? And I feel like I'm 100% with you. And hearing Coogler talk about that stuff and saying, like, you have to embrace it, like, because these characters and the actors especially are feeling the same thing. And how do you just recast and move on? You had to kind of put that into the movie. And I think, yeah, those opening moments, man, like, sure, Endgame starts, the end of Infinity War, the beginning of Endgame does start with that kind of very, when Hawkeye realizes his family is vanished, and it kind of is that somber start, leading into Tony being just floating into space. But there was something about the beginning of this movie that had that meta layer of, yeah, people mourning both Chadwick Boseman. You're now mourning this character, which they kind of just are forced into, who was going to be this huge part of the MCU, just, not forced into, but a choice of going, yeah, we're gonna kind of sunset this character in a very meta emotional way. And then, like, you have the Marvel Studios logo even come up with, like, no sound, which I thought, like, and it's just like, and then to make a popcorn movie after that, how do you do that, right? And it does, I think, does very well, mixes a very entertaining movie with a very emotional movie, with a very good MCU movie and a very good movie focusing on the women of Wakanda and these women who are mourning the loss of their king and their brother, their lover, their son. Like, it's doing a lot of things, and there's a lot of stuff in this movie, and we'll get more into that into the spoiler cast and throughout this spoiler-free episode. But yeah, it was a tricky spot, but I do believe, I mean, just to kick it off and get into our thoughts, is like that Ryan Coogler is one of my favorite working directors, especially in big budget, like Hollywood movies, like with the Creed franchise and producing the second and third movies of those coming up too. And the Black Panther movies. Like, I think he does a great job with this, and there is a lot going on. It's 3 hours. There's some stuff that probably didn't need to be in there and probably could have tightened up this movie. But overall, I think he delivers another fantastic antagonist. I don't even want to use the term villain, much like Killmonger in that first movie. And I think focusing on the women of Wakanda and giving them, each one of them, their kind of own really great moment or story that is also dealing, with the presence of, or the lost presence of T'Challa, that I think it ends up being a very good movie, a very good MCU movie. And I can't wait to talk about it more, but you go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, I liked it. I didn't love it as much as you. I think the strongest aspect is actually looking at this from the point of view of a human scale story and
Yeah.
what that means to lose somebody that was both a monolith in terms of being a king, a protector, a superhero, and then also someone who is a family member.
Yeah.
And what those two personalities and sort of perspectives bring into this narrative. And I think some of the strongest stuff in the movie character wise comes from Letitia Wright's performance as Shuri, as she's someone that feels completely helpless and frustrated, and though that she failed everybody, being one of the smartest people ever and always being able to innovate and come up with a solution, that she wasn't able to save her brother. And I think that that is just as powerful as any, threat to the world, or any kind of, transformation into a superhero. It's that feeling of helplessness, and that feeling of frustration and uselessness that you get when, you can just basically, you have to stand by and watch, as something horrible happens, and you have no power or control over it, and you have to accept it. And then on top of that, what that responsibility means, not only as someone grieving something very personal, but then
Yeah.
also being a part of a nation that has secluded itself from the rest of the world because it has been dealing with, oppression for so long, and wanting to keep away from the rest of the world, and the rest of the world seeing this loss and wanting to take advantage of that in a way where it's like, you see the strength and, steadfastness of Angela Bassett's Queen
Gosh,
in
she's
one.
so good in this.
She's always been a great
Yeah,
actor. I
I
mean,
know,
since
but
Critters 4, man, she's always been awesome. But there's a moment where there's this Geneva courtroom scene, and just because she's grieving doesn't mean she isn't a leader, and that, make no mistake about it, she does not suffer fools. And when you watch those scenes, they give power to, the complexity of geopolitics within the MCU, but also with that emotional layer of somebody that can both grieve and has those vulnerable feelings, but also, has to be showing a strong face for the
yeah.
rest of the country, of the world that she is leading now, and being there also for her daughter and for her people.
Yeah, and then you put it perfectly, and I think that's, both with Black Panther and now Wakanda Forever. I mean, I think Coogler, both of these scripts, like, he does such a fantastic job of putting, real world issues and problems, and what, different nations deal with, and things like that, and going over to, how they introduce Namor. I think we talked a little bit about this, and I hate the comparison of always DC versus Marvel, but like, we just did our Black Adam review and things like that, and that, with Killmonger in the first one and Namor in this one, I feel like moving on to that other side, and what the whole movie is about, is between these two nations that are kind of, both trying to protect their people from the outside world, whether it's the United States trying to find vibranium to use, or just, Namor, the whole surface world finding out about them, just much like Wakanda was in secret in that first movie. I think Tenoch Huerta is fantastic as Namor. I think that whole story of protecting your people, but maybe not going about it in the best ways, I think is done excellently in this movie. And I hate, again, I said bringing up Black Adam, but everything that movie was trying to do with Black Adam, of being the protector of his people, and trying to kind of keep uh, foreign entities out of that country, and taking over and things like that, I think is done so well in this movie, and is exactly what Black Adam was trying to do, where you are creating this sort of anti-hero, right? Because, like, much like Killmonger in that first one, where you're watching it and you're like, man, one, Michael B. Jordan's fantastic. Two, you kind of get where Killmonger is coming from. And I think the best Marvel villains are those ones you can connect with, where they are doing objectively bad things, but you start to go, I understand why they're doing it.
Or
You
they
don't
bring up a
necessarily.
really good
Yeah,
point.
exactly. And throughout that, I think Namor does, throughout this entire movie, and that whole juxtaposition between, sorry, what's his Talokan, or, like, is that where he's
Tolakan.
from? Talokan?
Yeah.
Between Talokan and Wakanda, and the similarities and the differences. And I think the juxtaposition between those two nations is done so well. And you have this, basically this war between these two, not necessarily countries, because Talokan is not known to everyone, but these two nations, I think is done so interestingly, and it is complicated. And then you add in everything that Wakanda's dealing with T'Challa. And I think that they do such a good job of, or Coogler especially, it does such a good job of like putting real world issues and into these villains, and you understanding their motivations and really kind of understand where they're coming from. And I think Namor is such a good villain throughout this movie, and that plays off of, you know, the complications of what Shuri's feeling with, going back to your point of how she's vulnerable at this moment and feeling like she failed, and that she's looking at the world now in a different way after T'Challa's gone. And I think they play on that stuff all really well. And then going over to Namor and the his people. I love the design of them all. Like it's so cool. Like all the underwater scenes are great. But the design of when they come out of the water and have to go onto the surface world, and like you see it in the trailers and stuff
Their
like that,
breathing
but like their
apparatuses.
breathing apparatus is so cool, man. Like it's just the whole design of this whole movie, and the tech in Wakanda, and just the designs of the characters, the costumes, like that's the stuff that always blew me away in that first movie. And I
Well, Ruth
think like
Carter
adding,
is an
yeah,
amazing costume designer, and we should say like the majority of the cast and crew are back for this, with the
yeah,
exception of Rachel Morrison as the cinematographer. So you're getting a lot of people that are building on something they already started.
started,
So
yeah,
it feels like even when welcoming in, you know, the Namor character in that world, it does, as you mentioned, have a familiar kind of connection to Wakanda because of the idea of, you know, colonial trauma and the
yeah,
oppression that is felt within, you know, both of these worlds. And so even bringing in a character like that thematically connects and is relatable and doesn't feel like shorthand, where there is some stuff that I will get into that does kind of feel like it's a little bit rushed, even though some of it was conceived for this film as a launching off point for future Marvel movies and series and things like that. But um, when you're watching kind of that kind of adversary relationship evolve, there are moments where you have uh, Tenoch Huerta and Letitia Wright having thoughtful conversations and not simply just fighting each other. And I think that that is so important as well. You know, they're fighting with their words, but their words are also in this kind of play where some of the things that they say back and forth to each other, it's like, you know what, he's not wrong, she's not wrong,
yeah.
I see where you're coming from, and there's this kind of almost respect for one another, you know, being leaders of you know, worlds that are innovators and far more advanced than the earth is in general.
Hmm. The other thing I wanted to bring up too is like Coogler is so good at playing in this MCU sandbox where the MCU can be taken very seriously at times, it can be very goofy at times, and then there is this weird thing that Coogler is so good with where there's a lot of things that should be very, very silly in both Black Panther and in Wakanda Forever. That Coogler just has a style to his filmmaking and the way he shoots action and the way that he, you know, shows you characters and the complicated nature of them, that like even goofy things like Namor's like little flying feet, or like he's got these feathers and wings on his feet that just like should be silly, and even like
It
you
almost
know
looks like
very,
something out of like a Red Bull commercial.
yeah, and and it's also very comic booky with its tech and its action and stuff like that. But like Cooler just does such a good job where you're never going, this is ridiculous. Like you're saying this is ridiculous in like a good way when you're watching certain sequences. But like I just feel like there is one costume choice which they are that they
I
do
know what
talk
you're talking about. Yeah.
that is goofy and still looks goofy, but I feel like overall the whole movie he does such a good job at taking things where like, and the MCU is I guess so good at that, like things that they built this universe and you believe in this universe so much when you watch these movies if you're into them, that things that should be like objectively really goofy or really silly come off as, you know, cool or you know, serious or something like that too, where I think throughout this whole movie there's just so many of those moments where I'm like, you're watching something and you're like, if I just explained this to someone who either wasn't into this, knew nothing about the MCU, or maybe like 20 years ago you're saying this is what we're seeing on screen, um There's been a lot of goofy movies and stuff like that too. Not
And also a goofy movie.
yeah. Also a Disney movie. Anyways, I just the whole style and everything and I think he just man, I'm so impressed with Coogler. But where do you want to go from here, Eric? So
Yeah, I think I'll bring up a couple criticisms. I quickly want to mention that Autumn Durald Arkenpaw is the cinematographer who replaced Rachel
okay.
Morrison on this. Sometimes I think it looks really good, and then there are other times where you do have that kind of, green screen, blue screen
Hmm.
backdrop thing where you can tell that the cinematographer maybe hasn't had as much
Experience.
experience
Yeah.
with kind of shooting, in a set or in a studio compared to shooting outside, but it still looks good.
It
And
does
and
look
and
good, but
and,
I
it, and
agree
it's
with you there.
yeah, and it kind of does have like that, backlot kind of feeling at times, but it doesn't like take away anything from the film. Narratively speaking, I think where you come into some hiccups in terms of a story that is very much about, reconciling with loss, is that you also have to realize that this is also, again, a corporate
Yeah.
enterprise, and
It's a sequel, it's part of the MCU. I
it's
get it.
it's
Yeah.
the end of a phase, but it's also launching a bunch of stuff. So when you introduce a character like Riri Williams, aka Ironheart, who's getting her own series, who's a character that's brought in, she's kind of brought in a way that's almost kind of like a little bit of a MacGuffin, an audience surrogate to the world of Wakanda, even though, I think we've spent enough time in Wakanda now to kind of get the beats and know it.
Yeah.
But it's still, again, the outsider looking in, but the familiar kind of idea of this young, African American woman who's a genius, and the world that she's kind of dipped her toe in, and she doesn't really even realize how uh deep she's gotten into it with why she's involved with it, and we'll get more into that with the spoilers. But um you know I don't mind the character or the performance by Dominique Thorne. I just think that to bring in a new character like this so quickly, and to kind of, again, be an audience surrogate to everything that's going on, but then also try to bring her into the emotional fold of everything, kind of feels a little bit hollow at times. And it's, again, not because the performance isn't bad, it's just that the performance is very much like comedic relief throughout a lot of it, and she's doing a lot of wisecracking and sort of reacting to everything that's going on. And it just kind of feels like, for every moment you have that is very insightful and compassionate and empathetic, and looking at this really complex situation that is both within the story and outside of it, in that meta layer, as you mentioned, it does feel tonally off every time we have those reactions, especially when you get into the third act, where it's like, I don't know if some of those moments were well deserved, in terms of it being, to focus on Shuri, and to focus on, Akoya, and to focus
Yeah.
on, characters that we've come to know throughout the first Black Panther movie, but also, sort of hinted at and referenced even in, Captain America Civil War. So
Yeah.
it just kind of feels a little bit off. And then you get some stuff with Martin Freeman's character, which is like, okay, I get why he's in it, because he was in the last one, and he's a part of like the connection to the outside world, and that kind
Exactly.
of
And the
American
government trying
liaison.
yeah, exactly. The government trying to find, vibranium
Yeah.
and stuff
And
like
him
that.
trying
Yeah.
to be like the one that's kind of like, well, no, like, I was saved by, Shuri, and her compassion towards me, and I don't I'm at this crossroads. I'm conflicted by the
Yeah.
situation that I've been put in. And
So
I
you
like
definitely get
that.
it, but
But
yeah,
I
go ahead.
but what it does, and we'll talk more about it in spoilers, because I do understand why it's in there, but at the
Yeah.
same time, it does feel like it throws off such a raw, sort of singular vision, that kind of feels like, oh, this is, again, weirdly comedic where it shouldn't be. And again, there's room
There's
for
a great
levity.
sort of cut you off for a sec. Like
Yeah.
the opening of the movie, I think sets up, the stakes and what the government's after, and that it's the US government and things like that, or the French government and stuff like that, that I agree with you completely. Like, I love this movie, but like both things you just brought up, I absolutely agree with. I love Riri Williams. I cannot wait for the Ironheart show. I think the character is great. I think Dominique Thorne is great. I do think that she's kind of wedged into this movie in a sort of awkward way, as sort of a plot device and sort of a strange second movie. We have to cram a lot into this. So let's also put in an introduction to a character that we'll get more of later. Like, I almost would have liked that reversed, where we had the Ironheart series first and got to know her. And maybe if she already popped up in this movie, then that we wouldn't have to put all that in here, and maybe the comedy still wouldn't work or something like that. But like, if that was switched around, I almost would have been more okay with it, even though I still ultimately think it works, and I ended up liking the character, and I can't wait to watch Ironheart. And I do like having Shuri having a contemporary that is, from the US and stuff like that too. I like that, and that juxtaposition there. And then with the Everett Ross stuff, I think they do such a good job in that opening to set up what the movie's about, that I don't know if you needed to keep going back to him. Like, it feels like they're just putting him in here, like, cause he's contracted and they have him, and like it's set up for future things, which again, Eric and I will talk about in the spoiler cast. But like, every time you cut over to him, you're like, just
It
get
throws the
back to,
pacing off
yeah, you're
completely.
like, especially in a 3-hour movie, like if you're going to have Riri Williams in this, then maybe don't have Everett Ross. Or if you're gonna have Everett Ross's whole subplot or
But
B
then
plot or
The
C
stuff with
plot,
Namor stuff
yeah,
as
is
well,
like,
right? Like, it all
which is
starts
much
to
more
add up.
interesting,
Yeah.
right? So like, every time you see Ross, you're like, just get back to Namor, or get back to Shuri, or get back to Angela Bassett. And like, I just I totally agree with you that that stuff is the stuff that kind of, at 2 hours and 45 minutes or whatever this movie is, it's beefy and it flew by for me. But those moments were the ones where I'm like, probably didn't need this in here. And it feels like, oh, okay, this is still very much an MCU movie. We still very much need to set up what's coming out. We know Everett Ross is going to be in Secret Invasion. Like, we kind of have to have that character pop up in Black Panther 2 because he was in the first one, and we know he's coming up in the future. We can't just have him be gone until Secret Invasion, although you probably could have.
Yeah, I
So
mean, they could have put him really in like Falcon and the Winter Soldier if they wanted him in something like
yeah,
a US government thing before Secret
it
Invasion.
just
Like,
feels like an afterthought here, where it's just like, I get that it is what you said. Like, I understand why they did. It's just every time you go there, you're like, this isn't nearly as interesting as everything else that's happening.
yeah, and I think that starts to build after a while for a film that is nearly 3 hours long, and you kind of feel like, oh, okay, like it is a little bit overstuffed with that stuff. And you do get some of the more traditional Marvel studio kind of plot points throughout as well, especially with the action and things like that. Like, there are moments that are very inventive and subtle. There's one in particular that I'll mention in the spoiler cast. But um it does feel like it kind of goes back to, that's why I think that's the one thing. Like, I know a lot of people didn't like She-Hulk, but like, I found She-Hulk's sort of third act
Refreshing. Yeah.
refreshing, because it tried to deconstruct that a little bit, where this kind of goes back to the classic, like, you have characters fighting each other, and it's just
And
like,
that's what the first Black Panther had too, right? Like, that
yeah,
the first 2/3 of that movie are excellent. And then you get to that last fight between Killmonger and T'Challa,
T'Challa.
and it's just like, all right. Like,
Yeah,
it's doing that Marvel thing of like the mirror fight kind of thing, right? Like,
yeah.
fighting yourself.
Or
And in this,
WandaVision did a really good
yeah.
job with that, with Vision, where Vision was fighting himself, but he was having, again, more of a conversation. It was a battle of wits, right? Where
And you
there
do get a little bit of that here,
Well,
but
I mentioned
yeah.
that with Namor and
Yeah.
Shuri, right? Having those conversations, like, they're diplomatic in a way, but there's still kind of like this fight, but the fight
And
is
they
with
still need a big
words.
war, right? They still need a
Yeah.
big battle sequence, right? Which is the MCU thing. Again, that goes back to our original points of this being, a really emotional, kind of complicated movie with deep themes and stuff like that. But at its core, it's still a popcorn MCU movie. It still needs to be entertaining. It still has to have action. It still has to have world building. It still has to have like the MCU building. Like it all has to have those pieces that kind of, when I said in my tweet, and it's one of your biggest criticisms, Eric, is there's a lot going on in this movie, and you probably could have tightened it up and made something really phenomenal if you kind of tightened it up a little bit. But
You
that
could have
being
made
said,
something re phenomenal.
yeah. That being said, it's still wholly entertaining, and like it's even if it's a little bloated at times, or you do to your point, you felt the length a little bit where I kind of felt like it flew by, but it's still ultimately like I think in that last act, and again we'll go more into this in the spoiler cast. It's so hard to when we do these MCU movies where we really don't want to spoil when we don't want to spoil anything. It's so hard to talk about specifics, but I do think the last act does a little bit of what you're saying, because I feel like there is one big, obviously, action sequence, but at least I feel like because of the complicated nature and the juxtaposition between those two nations, they do it in an interesting, in a sort of interesting way. Um,
Loved Ludwig Gordson's score.
oh my
There's a
god,
new theme
popped
that
off,
rips.
man. That's like the whole score rips. I mean, he crushed it in the first movie.
Right.
Um, and obviously a lot of those themes come back for this, but he plays with music so well, both with it's not necessarily, he probably helped produce the actual soundtrack to the licensed music, which is all great throughout the movie, but the actual score, which uses a lot of the stuff from the first Black Panther, obviously elevated in different ways, and there's some somber moments like we talked about, but then there's like Namor's themes and stuff like that, and
Playing
the
with like
way,
the ancient Mayan sort
God, it's
of
so good.
civilization. But yeah, it gives this kind of texture, and it feels very much like it is the character's identity. It's a part of their identity,
And that's when
and
music, especially in the MCU, is at its best, right? Is
yeah.
like when you have these themes that are attached to these characters or these worlds that you can use in other film, and that's the type of world building and fun serialized filmmaking. Why I love the MCU is like everything of like taking iconic pieces of score, and now you're going to hear that maybe in an upcoming X-Men project or something like that, right? Or like whenever they bring back the Talokan Nation or something like that, like and we've seen that
Comic-Con and
Wakanda.
Talakon.
Yeah, Comic-Con's taking place in Comic-Con Talokan. And then like we've heard that with the Black Panther themes, right? Like when we heard it in Falcon and the Winter Soldier, we've heard it pop up in What If or things like that. Like all you need is that couple like notes, right? Like especially with Black Panther, you just said the like it, and I did it bad, but like you just hear that like that beat, and you're like, I know exactly what they're referencing. And there's so many like great moments in this movie where Ludwig just pops the fuck off and is just like absolutely, and it does, a great score elevates a movie, right? Like where you're just like, oh fuck, like I'm all in right now with this action sequence or this dramatic beat or something, because the score is adding to it, right? And he's on another level. He's so good.
Yeah, I mean the two people we haven't really mentioned in terms of the cast are the two us actors, actually, Lupita Nyong'o
Sure.
and Winston Duke. Winston Duke is a lot of fun and kind of
Daniel Kaluuya not back in this movie, just
no,
so
one of the Jordan Peele actors is
yeah.
not.
I just thought I'd mention that
He was dealing with a cloud issue, I think.
yeah, he was shooting a Nope, right?
Yeah.
Which is why he couldn't do this. Yeah.
Yeah. Which would have been amazing if they like cut to him like,
Yeah. Wearing a jean jacket.
yeah. But yeah, I love Winston Duke because he is again comedic relief here, but he's not
M'Baku's
over.
such a fun character.
Yeah, he's not overbearing either. Like he's not one of those characters that you throw in and it's like, okay, like oh, like we're getting another joke, kind of thing. Where it's like he is a very powerful character, but he's also one that kind of steps in it at times, and you kind
Yeah.
of like that.
There's a couple moments where I literally laughed out loud
Yeah,
from him.
yeah, just the way he eats something
Yeah,
is
that's what I was
amazing.
gonna reference too. That's
The
exactly what I
sound
was gonna
design is
reference.
incredible, but
It's
like
really
he's
good.
so charismatic as an actor, Winston Duke. I just he hasn't had many leading roles as of yet, so I other than 9 days, but yeah, I hope he gets more. Like, I would love to see him take on his own like action franchise or something. I don't know. And then Lupita Nyong'o, like, I think we'll talk more
Who's
about
always great
her
too.
in
Yeah.
spoilers. But yeah, it's interesting where we are first introduced to her character again, because it does, this isn't spoiler really. It does take some time to reintroduce her, and I think that it
Yeah.
makes sense with how they kind of bring her back a little later on in the movie and not right away. So with that in mind, it's like, she kind of reminds you of why she is such a great actor, but on top of that, it's like it makes you think like, what a waste that the 355 was.
Oh yeah.
Because the character kind of like again, we'll get into it more with spoilers. The character where she is in this movie kind of reminded me where the character is in the 355. So yeah.
Yeah, you're not wrong. You're not wrong. And we did touch on Angela Bassett, but she, I think, absolutely crushes this movie.
Yeah.
Like with giving her a little bit more to do than in the first one, and she was great in the first one too. But
Great
you
since
mentioned,
Critters 4.
yeah, you mentioned that scene in the government hall or whatever
Yeah.
the hell it
In
is,
Geneva, yeah.
in Geneva, and but then throughout the whole movie, like, um, Shuri is very much the emotional core of this movie, but Ramonda, like, she does a lot of heavy lifting, and Angela Bassett is so fantastic. Like my highlights were Letitia Wright, Angela Bassett, and Tenoch Huerta were the three like standouts for me. Where and you mentioned like everyone's great in their roles and they're coming into their own too, being playing these characters a couple times now too. But I was just surprised that I know Angela Bassett's a great actress, but like I just wasn't expecting her to go so hard in this movie because I feel like there are those really showy moments. Um, but like they just, I don't know, they're just done so organically and well because of that kind of meta nature of what the characters are dealing with and what the actors are dealing with and what the audience is dealing with, that it just brings this kind of emotional kind of depth to the performance. And I just feel like she's really 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 good.
Yeah, and I think another thing, like, her character surprisingly is not like, again, the word compassion has come up a lot, but her character is also fierce, and she can really just bring you to your knees, and that can mean, people that are antagonists or people that are close to her. And she'll let you have it because she is not mincing words at this
Mhm.
point. And we'll again go into this more in spoilers, but there's one moment where I was like, oh, in so many other movies, usually, that interpersonal relationship with other characters that they're familiar with are like, kind of, not scolding in the sense, but like kind of like telling you off, like, oh, you know better, like, make sure you do better next time. But there's something in this that happens that goes a little bit more in a kind of like, oh wow, like, she really, like, just, demonstrated why she's the queen.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything else you want to touch on before we kind of just give our final scores here? I'm trying to think if there's anything we kind of missed talking on.
I don't think so. I think it's one of
Yeah,
those movies where it's like we'll have more to say within the spoiler discussion and even in our regular
as
show with
people
the
see
press
it and
conference.
kind
And
of,
yeah,
yeah.
and as it has time to kind of settle and people will watch it, and I do think, like, we'll talk about this more again, but of phase 4, looking at it as a whole, I would probably say that this, even though my rating might not seem as high,
Sure,
I
but that's
do
on phase 4 in general too.
I do think that this is probably the strongest movie within phase 4. I do feel that maybe in terms of the series stuff, both Loki and WandaVision are maybe a little bit more innovative with kind of playing with, the structure of an MCU plot, where this is very much the emotional core of phase 4, and this is, this is the heart and soul of what phase 4 is. And I think that this is the best movie, and the one that wasn't disappointing or was just purely entertainment. Like, it kind of felt like it had a good balance, because catharsis and corporate synergy doesn't work all the time or ever. And I think that Ryan Coogler did the best
He
job he
could, yeah.
possibly could, given the impossible circumstances of making a movie work like this.
I absolutely agree with you. I think it's fighting with Shang-Chi for me as like my favorite Phase 4 movie, cuz I feel like it's very different, because I think with Shang-Chi I went in like not maybe knowing what to expect, not knowing much about the character. And I think I just like the action sequences maybe more in Shang-Chi, but it also still has like a style and a vibe to it that I really, really loved. And I think when I came out of Shang-Chi, I felt like exhilarated. Like I was like, oh shit, like I really, really like that movie a lot. Sure, the last act also kind of falls into that kind of CGI fest kind of territory, but I just feel like it's fighting with Shang-Chi as my favorite Phase 4 movie. And I feel like, that's not a super high bar, because like, Black Widow's fine, Eternals we didn't really love. Um, Love and Thunder I know you didn't really care for. I thought it was fun, but like I don't really have strong feelings on it. So like Phase 4 has been a bit of a mixed bag, and I'm interested to see, once we are close to the end of the multiverse saga, how everyone feels about it. Like, because the MCU is so interesting, where I feel like I change my thoughts on movies as I rewatch them with the context
As
that
you
I've
re-watch them.
yeah, as I rewatch them. Um, and when I've seen movies in the future or shows in the future that I feel like then add to the movies of the past and the shows maybe the shows of the past as we move forward and stuff like
Days of
that
Future
too. So
Past.
like going back and watching Age of Ultron after seeing WandaVision and stuff like that, or seeing Loki's journey and or all that kind of stuff. Like I think it changes and uh morphs into different things as you kind of get more of this universe. So I'm curious to see, like, once we have all the puzzle pieces, like, are we going to look back at some of those movies that felt is whatever, and then go, oh shit, that had that moment? Or it's not necessarily retconning. I feel like it's like what Andor's doing right now. I feel like it's elevating Rogue One to the point where like the best stuff, either whether it comes in the future and is a prequel, or is something in the future, where if it adds some context or brings something to that original property, it can kind of make that thing better if that thing is really, really good. So, yeah, I think it's up there with Shang-Chi. On the TV shows, I'm with you with Loki and WandaVision. Um, I think those two are just absolute bangers. But then I also love She-Hulk. I loved Miss Marvel. I liked elements of Hawkeye. So like,
Disappointed with Moon Knight.
yeah, disappointed with Moon Knight. So it's interesting looking back at Phase 4 now that we're sort of done. Like they say this is the end of Phase 4 because it's the last movie in Phase 4.
Except for
We
the
do.
Guardian special.
Well, and the Guardian special, which is like a TV movie, but it's going to only be 45 minutes, but like, or I think 45 minutes, maybe an hour. And it's probably just going to be like a fun thing. It's not really going to have big lasting implications on the MCU, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe
The
Kevin
Bacon
Bacon is
verse.
like, yeah, Kevin Bacon's the newest member of Guardians of the Galaxy, and he's in Volume 3. Who knows? But I really, really loved
Riri.
this. I did love this movie. Like I throughout the whole thing, I was like, oh, like I had plenty of like, oh shit. Like I loved certain action sequences, and we'll go into all of this stuff more, but maybe
Namor. We'll go into it more. Namor.
God damn it. I will go into it more, and I know we keep saying it in the spoiler
Namor.
cast, and maybe it's recency bias, and I love the MCU, so I'm always like, again, I'm mostly at least entertained by these movies at worst. So I'm going to give the movie a 4.5. I'm taking the 0.5 off for some of the same things Eric mentioned, which is a little overstuffed. The Everett Ross stuff feels like it doesn't need to be there. The Riri Williams stuff, it's so hard to say sometimes. Feels like maybe I would have liked that character introduced earlier and then brought in a supporting role in this movie. But overall, I was just like thoroughly entertained. I felt like it was emotional from start to finish. I think Namor is one of the top tier MCU villains with Killmonger. Like I feel like Coogler just gets it. Like when it comes to villains in the MCU, and I just thoroughly enjoyed this movie. So 4.5 for me.
Yeah, I liked it, but again, I do have some criticisms just with the narrative structure and the Marvel Cinematic Universe of it all. Sometimes, getting in the way of telling a really kind of poignant and impactful story, which is
Singular
there,
story,
and
yeah.
and throwing it off a little bit from time to time, and with that, it's like it kind of becomes frustrating after a while. And even though I understand you need a little bit of room to have the characters explore, their emotions and have more of an interior life, it does feel still a little long in by the time you get to that third act. So with that, I'm going to give it a 3.5, but it could very well go up to 4 or 4.5 in due time, because again, there's a lot of stuff that I really do Riri do like. And so, like, I also do really like Riri Williams. I just think that, like, again, like, I think you made a good point where maybe the shorthand should have been the series first and then bring her into this, because at least you would have a little bit more of a connection to her than just kind of having to really, again, cheat your way
Riri.
through. Yeah, exactly. And so with all that said, I still like the movie a lot. It's just not on that level of the first Black Panther, or Iron Man 3, in that it just kind of, or
I
the first
love
Guardians
I
movie.
love how much me and you love Iron Man 3, because we're
Iron
like
Man
in a
3 rocks.
yeah, I know. I think people will look back on
And
Iron
that's
Man
why I
3
like this
fondly.
though too. I think there is some comparison there where Iron Man 3 not only felt like, we always talk about like Shane Black being one of the first guys, and Gunn a little bit as well, kind of bringing their own personality and voice into the MCU. But what I also like about Iron Man 3 is that Iron Man 3 actually looked at the events, post first Avengers movie, and was like, okay, well, Tony is suffering from post traumatic stress disorder. And it kind
Mhm.
of felt like it was taking a little bit of time to really give these characters some space to breathe from
Yeah.
such a, you know global, international world event that would have that psychological impact, where you know the world of Wakanda is mourning a loss, and fans of Chadwick Boseman are still feeling that as well. And it's even more heartening when he gets an Oscar nomination for Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, and you think like, oh, that's it, but then you still have this movie, and even though he's not in it, his presence is
Is
always
felt.
felt,
Yeah.
and that legacy will be everlasting.
Yeah, that's a great point, and something I would have never. I think not many people will compare this movie to Iron Man 3, just because, and even the way it strips Tony down and takes away the Iron Man suit, right? Like,
Yeah.
something we didn't really talk about in this review, which we'll go more into in the spoiler cast, is that, like, there's there's no Black Panther, basically. We've seen in the trailers that there is going to be a new Black Panther, but, like, his presence is missed in this movie, right? Like, it's, I don't know if it's a negative, because the way that they handle it, I think we both think that they did it at least well, and very well, but his presence is, you take a Black Panther movie and then take the Black Panther away, and then you're making a Wakanda movie for the most part. I think is interesting, and kind of like what you said, with Tony, and what Tony's dealing with is what the women of Wakanda are dealing with, not necessarily one to one. We're just comparing, like, when the MCU tackles emotional topics.
Or more
Um,
human themes within
Human themes, yeah.
within the superhero genre,
Yes,
because the superhero themselves usually deal with superficial
exactly, yeah.
qualities, where, like, we joke that, like, in some things it is a little silly, where like the Falcon can't get a loan or something like that, but at least now they are trying to incorporate things that even heroes can't necessarily get across. And that's again like why I think the one aspect of something like Superman works so well in the Richard Donner movie or in the original comic books, is that Superman can save anybody, do anything, but internally speaking, he couldn't save Pa Kent. you know.
But in Man of Steel, he could have, and he just didn't.
Yeah,
So
and that's another one of the many reasons why Zack Snyder's Man of Steel sucks.
that's where we're gonna end this. Really?
Yes.
Anyways,
Yeah.
Black Panther: Wakanda Forever is great. You're gonna go see it. If you're listening to this, you might have already seen it. But if you have already seen it, go check out our spoiler cast. It will be available basically as the movie drops, or I'm gonna post it the minute the first screenings get out. So
So
the
Thursday night then?
Thursday
So the
night
10th?
is Thursday the 10th. Our
And it
spoiler
opens
cast
wide
will
on
be
November the 11th.
yes. There are early screenings starting at 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern. So around 9 p.m. Eastern, our spoiler cast will be live. So you guys can go check that out right after you see the movie. You guys can also check out the latest episode of the Untitled Movie Podcast, which is episode 137. Eric and I attended the virtual press conference for Black Panther: Wakanda Forever. We'll talk a little bit about what Ryan Coogler said and what Letitia Wright and the rest of the cast kind of talked about in that press conference, as well as maybe where we kind of see the MCU without that. Won't have any spoilers in it either, because we're going to be dropping that as you're listening to this. It's available for you guys now. We have other reviews that you guys can go check out for movies like Causeway, shows like Tales of the Jedi, James Gunn's Armageddon Time, After Sun,
You
The
said
Good
James
Nurse.
Gunn's Armageddon.
Sorry, James Gunn. That'd be a very different movie. Sorry,
James Gray.
I got MCU on the mind. James Gray's Armageddon Time. I would like to see James Gray's Guardians of the Galaxy Christmas special.
Oh my God.
It'd be very different.
It'd be very depressing.
After Sun, The Good Nurse, Black Adam that we mentioned, Halloween Ends, Tar, Rosalind, Amsterdam, all of our TIFF content. Head over to Untitled Movie Reviews, or you're already there, or on YouTube. Which I think we have a new URL because I picked our username on YouTube because it's a new thing. So I think you can just go to youtube.com/@Untitled Movie Podcast. And
user wins.
and you guys can go check out everything over on our YouTube channel. One-stop shop for everything. Head over to Letterboxd, which is Untitled_movies. And as always, my name is Matt Rohrbeck. You can find more of my work around the internet, but mostly at UntitledMoviePodcast.com. And you can follow me on all those social medias at Matt Rohrbeck. I'd usually send you over to Twitter, but who the hell knows by the time you're listening to this what that is. So maybe follow us on Letterboxd. I don't know where people are going to talk about things anymore.
We're on movies, Instagram.
For movies specifically,
Letterboxd.
Letterboxd, which is maybe where I'm going to start. I used to do my tweet reviews after I saw a movie, but maybe I'll start actually doing Letterboxd reviews because I never usually did that. But I don't. It's so depressing, anyways. But still follow me on Twitter while you can.
Well, it's a great way to follow that one up. I'm Eric March, and you can find more of my video reviews on rogerstv.com/cinemascene and on the social medias at em6211. I'm still on Twitter for now, I guess, but who knows what that hellscape will bring today, tomorrow, or oh God, what a nightmare.
Until next time.
I miss Chadwick Boseman. T'Challa forever.